Picture this. September 14, 1945, just outside Nottingham, England, in a detention facility where 23 German women are about to experience something that will shatter everything they've ever been taught. The knock comes at dawn, not the brutal hammering they'd been trained to expect, but a firm, measured rapping. 3 careful strikes against the wooden barracks door, and inside those walls, 23 hearts stop beating for just a moment. Some women drop the torn blankets they've been clutching like armor. Others reach instinctively for each other's hands, searching for courage in touch. And the youngest among them, a girl named Greta, who turned 19 somewhere over the Atlantic Ocean during that terrifying crossing, presses herself against the far wall and begins whispering the only prayer she can remember from childhood. The words tumbling out in desperate rhythm. They know what men do to captured women because they've been told since they were children in the Bund Deutscher Mädel, told in whispers and warning stories, told in the careful way their mothers fell silent when certain topics arose at the dinner table. And they've seen it too. Seen it in those frantic final days when women were pulled from cellars in Berlin, when nurses were dragged screaming from field hospitals as the fronts collapsed around them like houses of cards. The propaganda promised them that the British were no better than anyone else, maybe even worse because they hid their cruelty behind politeness and proper manners, like wolves in gentlemen's clothing. "They'll make us strip for inspection," murmurs Liesel, her voice cracking with fear, and another voice hisses back from the darkness, We won't take our clothes off." But even as she says it, they all know that choice might not be theirs to make. The door swings open, and if you've never heard this story, you're not alone, because this chapter of history was buried for decades, hidden in archives and fading memories. So hit subscribe right now, so you never miss the untold stories that textbooks deliberately left out. 3 British guards stand in the door frame, silhouetted against the pale morning light, and they're wearing standard khaki uniforms that are clean and pressed. And the women can smell soap and tobacco, ordinary smells that seem impossibly out of place in this moment of terror. One of the guards is a middle-aged man with thinning hair and wire-rimmed glasses, and he's holding a clipboard like he's about to take attendance at a school. Another carries something wrapped in brown paper that could be anything. And the third guard is barely older than the prisoners themselves, keeping his eyes fixed somewhere above their heads as though he can't bear to look directly at them, as though their fear is too heavy for him to witness. "Good morning," the man with the clipboard says in careful, accented German, and then he says something that makes absolutely no sense to anyone in that room. "We've brought breakfast." Silence falls like a stone into deep water, and the women just stare, because this doesn't fit any script they've rehearsed in their minds. Breakfast, not orders to undress, not commands to line up for processing, not the leering inspection they'd steeled themselves against through the long night. Just breakfast, just a simple morning meal like they're guests at an inn instead of prisoners of war. The guard with the brown paper package steps forward slowly, telegraphing every movement so no one will be startled, and he sets it on the rough wooden table in the center of the room. And when he unfolds the wrapping, the smell hits them first, and it's a smell that brings tears to eyes that have been dry for months. Bread, real bread, still warm from some kitchen oven, with a golden crust that has somehow survived the rationing that grips all of Britain in these lean post-war days. And beside it, he places a tin of margarine, a jar of marmalade glowing like amber in the morning light, and impossibly, miraculously, a glass bottle of fresh milk. "We'll be back in an hour with hot water for washing," the older guard says, glancing at his clipboard and then back at the women with something that might be gentleness in his eyes. "You'll need to register your names and units for the records, but there's no rush. Eat first, take your time." Then they leave, just walk out and close the door behind them with a simple click. And the women realize with dawning shock that it's unlocked. that they could have opened it from the inside at any moment, that they're not locked in like animals in a cage. For a long time, nobody moves, nobody breathes, and then Greta begins to cry. Really cry. The kind of sobbing that comes from somewhere deep in the chest. And that breaks the spell that's holding everyone frozen. These women had not expected to become prisoners of war because most of them never expected to leave Germany at all. Never imagined they'd cross an ocean or stand on enemy soil or face this strange, gentle captivity. They were not soldiers, not in the traditional sense that anyone would recognize. They were communications auxiliaries, radio operators, telephonists, and cipher clerks who'd been recruited from the women's labor service and scattered across occupied Europe as the Wehrmachtsfast administrative Apparatus swelled beyond what men alone could staff in a war that consumed everything it touched. There were nurses too, and secretaries attached to Luftwaffe field hospitals, women who wore gray-blue uniforms with the eagle and swastika insignia, who'd been taught to march in formation, to salute properly, to file reports in triplicate, who'd been told over and over that they were essential to the war effort, the invisible backbone that kept armies fed and supplied and connected across thousands of miles of conquered territory. And when the Reich collapsed in the spring of 1945, when everything they'd been promised turned to ash and smoke, they'd been told nothing at all, just left to figure out survival on their own. Liesl Hartmann was 24 years old and had worked the radio desk at a signal station in Schleswig-Holstein, spending her days transcribing weather reports and supply requisitions in a cramped room that smelled of machine oil and stale coffee. And when British troops rolled through on May 6th, 2 days before the official surrender, she and 14 other women had simply stood up from their desks with their hands raised and waited. No firefight, no dramatic last stand. Just the quiet surrender of people who understood the war was over and felt nothing but relief. Margaret Fisher was 31 and had been a surgical nurse in a field hospital outside Hamburg, and she'd amputated gangrenous limbs by candlelight, held dying boys' hands while they slipped away from sepsis, learned to sleep through the sound of shells exploding close enough to shake the building's foundations. And when the fighting finally stopped, she'd walked out into the hospital courtyard still wearing her blood-spattered apron and asked the first British medical officer. She saw if she could please keep working because the wounded didn't. Stop being wounded just because someone signed a piece of paper. He'd said no, gently but firmly, and she'd had no choice but to surrender. Greta Schultz was only 19 and had worked in a communications bunker beneath Berlin for 3 months before the city fell, typing orders she didn't understand and forwarding messages about divisions that no longer existed. And on April 30th, when someone whispered that the Führer was dead, she'd felt nothing, just a vast echoing numbness that scared her more than any bomb ever had. The Russians came 5 days later, and Greta fled west with a column of refugees, walked 200 kilometers in boots that disintegrated around her feet until she was practically barefoot, and finally collapsed at a British checkpoint near Lübeck. And they'd given her water, clean water from a canteen, and she'd told them everything she knew because what did secrets matter anymore in a world that had ended? By August of 1945, nearly 3,000 German women from various auxiliary units had been rounded up across the British occupation zone, and most would be repatriated within months, sent back to a shattered Germany to fend for themselves among the ruins. But a few hundred women, those who'd worked in sensitive communications roles, who might possess intelligence value, or who'd been captured in territories that required further processing, were shipped west to Britain itself, crossing the sea to enemy territory. The crossing had been a nightmare painted in shades of gray and green and the color of fear, and they'd boarded a transport ship at Cuxhaven on a morning thick with fog that made everything seem unreal. And no one told them where they were going. No one explained anything. Rumors swirled through the cargo hold like smoke. America, Canada, England, Scotland, or perhaps just the bottom of the North Sea. A convenient solution to the problem of what to do with women who'd served the enemy and knew too much. They were herded below deck into a cargo hold that still smelled of the ammunition crates it had carried on the voyage east. 200 women packed into a space meant for freight. And the air grew thick and hot, and someone vomited, then someone else, and soon the smell was unbearable, mixing with fierce sweat and unwashed bodies, and the salt smell of the sea. "I thought we'd drown," Liesl would write years later in a diary that would be recovered in 1982, "or suffocate, either way. I couldn't imagine arriving anywhere alive. Couldn't imagine a future that extended beyond that dark hold and the rolling of the ship." Hi! But they didn't drown. And after 36 hours of rolling seas and rising panic, the engines changed pitch and the ship slowed. And through the gaps in the deck above they heard seagulls. The first birds they'd heard in days. And then voices in English, sharp and efficient, calling out numbers and coordinates like they were just cargo being unloaded. The ship bumped against a dock, and a hatch opened and light poured in. Shocking and bright and painful after the darkness. And someone shouted, "Up! Everyone up, single file! Let's go!" They climbed a narrow ladder into the shocking brightness of an English afternoon. And the port. They'd learn later it was Harwich, stretched before them in all its impossible abundance. Cranes, warehouses, men in uniform moving with the purposeful chaos of any military logistics hub. But it was the abundance that struck them silent, that made them want to weep. Because trucks lined up bumper to bumper with their beds piled high with crates of supplies, mountains of coal, stacks of timber, and beyond the port, through the gaps between buildings, they glimpsed green fields, actual green grass, not the cratered, shell-blasted gray they'd grown accustomed to over years of war. Germany was starving, its cities reduced to rubble, its people digging in ruins for scraps. And here even the seagulls looked fat and healthy. They were loaded onto trains, actual passenger coaches with seats, not cattle cars, and given sandwiches wrapped in waxed paper, white bread and ham and a sliver of cheese. And Greta ate hers in 3 desperate bites, and then cried into her hands because it was the first real food she'd had in weeks. And the taste of it broke something inside her. The train carried them north through a landscape that seemed almost offensively intact. Villages with roofs still on the houses, churches with spires pointing up at the sky, children actually playing in fields without fear of bombs or artillery. And there was no rubble, no craters, no burned-out husks of buildings like the skeleton fingers of a dead city. Margaret pressed her face to the window and felt something crack inside her chest. Not quite anger, and not quite grief, but some terrible mixture of both emotions. "They didn't suffer," she whispered to no one in particular. "Not like we did." But that wasn't quite true, as they would learn later, because Britain had suffered its own way through the Blitz and the U-boat blockades, and the rationing that would stretch on for years after the war ended. But the difference was that Britain had survived with its infrastructure largely intact, while Germany had been ground to dust under the boots of armies from east and west. They arrived at the detention facility near Nottingham as the sun was setting, painting the sky in colors that seemed too beautiful for the circumstances, and it was a converted estate, they learned. Some wealthy family's country house that had been requisitioned for the war effort and never given back to its original owners. It had barbed wire now and guard towers and rows of hastily constructed wooden barracks. But it also had running water and electricity, and a kitchen that produced actual meals at regular intervals. Small miracles that felt impossibly luxurious after what they'd been through. That first night they huddled together in silence, waiting for the other shoe to drop, waiting for the kindness to reveal itself as a trap. But morning came with that knock on the door, and the breakfast that changed everything. The bread moment stayed with them even years later when they'd returned to Germany and rebuilt their lives from scratch. They'd remember the smell of warm bread and the quiet voice of the British guard who'd said "eat first," as though that were the most natural thing in the world, as though feeding prisoners before interrogating them were just common decency rather than an act of mercy. This is where everything they'd been taught began to unravel, where the propaganda met reality and reality won. Stay with us, and don't forget to hit the like button if you're learning something new, because it wasn't just the breakfast, it was what came after. The slow accumulation of small mercies that didn't fit the script they'd been given. That first afternoon, a woman in a Red Cross uniform arrived. British, middle-aged, with tired eyes that had seen too much suffering and a gentle manner that immediately put no one at ease because they didn't trust gentleness. Not yet. Through a translator, she explained that they'd each receive a medical examination, and she emphasized the word voluntary, said they could refuse if they wanted, but it was recommended given the conditions they'd endured during transport. The women exchanged glances that spoke volumes without words, because a medical examination meant one thing in their experience, and they knew what that meant, or thought they did, because the euphemisms for violation were well rehearsed in their minds. "I'll go first," Margaret said quietly, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes, because she was the oldest, the one who'd seen the most horror in those field hospitals, and if it was going to be bad, better she face it first and warn the others. The examination room was clean, almost clinical in a way that felt foreign after months of chaos, and a female doctor, also British, also middle-aged, gestured for Margaret to sit, and there was no examination table with stirrups, just a chair. Just a simple wooden chair. The doctor checked her pulse with cool professional fingers, listened to her lungs, looked in her throat with a small light, and she noted some malnutrition, mild dehydration, the early signs of a respiratory infection that needed treatment. She prescribed rest, extra rations from the kitchen, and penicillin, that miracle drug they'd only heard whispers about, that was saving lives across Europe. "That's all?" Margaret asked through the translator, not quite believing what was happening. "That's all," the doctor confirmed with a slight smile. "Unless there's something else you'd like to discuss, any other concerns?" Margaret walked back to the barracks in a complete daze, her mind trying to process what had just happened, or rather what hadn't happened. "She just examined me," she told the others who were waiting with anxious faces. "Like a doctor. Like a real doctor, that's all. Nothing else." Over the following days and weeks, the pattern held like a promise being kept over and over, and meals arrived 3 times daily with clockwork regularity. Simple but adequate porridge and tea for breakfast, soup and bread for lunch, some kind of meat stew for dinner with root vegetables, and occasionally pudding for dessert. No one made them work beyond basic cleaning duties in their own quarters. No one shouted at them or called them names. No one struck them or threatened them. And the guards maintained professional distance but weren't cruel, weren't vindictive, weren't any of the things they'd been promised British soldiers would be. They'd even installed a radio in the common room, though they were careful about what broadcasts they allowed, filtering out anything too inflammatory, but allowing music and news and even some entertainment programs. Greta found herself crying at strange, unexpected moments, over a cup of hot tea that warmed her hands, over the feel of a clean blanket that didn't smell of mildew, over the simple fact that she'd been allowed to sleep through the night without interruption, without air raid sirens or artillery fire or the sound of boots on stairs. "I don't understand," she said to Lysel one evening as they sat together in the common room. "Why are they being kind to us?" Lysel, who'd spent the war transcribing orders and learning to read between the lines of official communications, had a theory that she shared slowly, choosing her words carefully. "Maybe because they can afford to be," she said. "They won. They don't need to prove anything, don't need to demonstrate their power by breaking us. But that didn't fully explain it, because kindness, they were learning, took many forms and came from unexpected places. And there was the day Liesel received a package not from home, because mail from Germany was still barely functioning, but from the camp administration, and inside was a thick wool cardigan, gently worn but clean and soft, and a note in careful English that the translator read aloud. From the Women's Voluntary Service, stay warm. There was the afternoon Greta mentioned almost casually that it was her birthday. She hadn't expected anyone to remember or care, because what were birthdays in the aftermath of apocalypse? But that evening, the camp cook, a British woman named Mrs. Davies, who'd lost 2 sons in the war and had every reason to hate Germans, appeared with a small cake. Not much, just flour and sugar and a scraping of jam. But she'd used her own rations to make it, given up something precious in a time of scarcity. 20 years old deserves a cake, Mrs. Davies said gruffly, not quite meeting Greta's eyes. And Greta sobbed so hard she couldn't eat it for 10 minutes, just stared at it through tears, while the other women gathered around in silent witness to this impossible kindness. There was the guard, the young one who'd avoided their eyes that first morning, who started teaching them English phrases during the evening recreation hour. Not officially, he said, just might be useful for them to know. And his name was Thomas, and he was 22 years old, and he'd landed at Normandy and fought through France and seen things he didn't talk about, couldn't talk about, but he spoke to them like people, not prisoners, not enemies, just people. Sometimes he'd show them photographs of his family farm in Dorset, creased pictures he kept in his wallet, and he'd point and say, "This is my mum," and "That's our dog Birdie, useless for herding but a good lad." And his voice would get soft and homesick when he talked about the rolling hills and the smell of hay. Margaret, who'd spent months learning to see German soldiers as boys first and enemies second, as humans who bled and cried and called for their mothers when they were dying, found herself doing the same with Thomas, seeing him as just a boy in uniform like all the others, like the ones she'd tried desperately to save in that field hospital. The cognitive dissonance was exhausting, this constant collision between what they'd been taught and what they were experiencing, because they'd been indoctrinated, really, taught from childhood that the British were barbaric, that they'd show no mercy to German civilians, that captured German women could expect only brutality and violation and death. The propaganda had been specific and detailed and designed to terrify, painting pictures of horrors that would make resistance seem like the only option. And yet here they were, fed and clothed and allowed to write letters home, censored yes, but allowed, even permitted to organize their own recreation schedule. One evening in late October, when the air was getting cold and the leaves were falling from the trees beyond the fence, someone suggested they sing, and it felt dangerous at first. German songs, German voices raised together in harmony. Because would the guards burst in and accuse them of sedition, of plotting, of maintaining loyalty to a regime that had crumbled into ruins? But they sang anyway, quietly at first and then with growing confidence. And they sang Guten Abend, Gute Nacht, the Brahms lullaby that every German child knew, that their mothers had sung to them in safer times. Halfway through the second verse, Margaret noticed Thomas standing in the doorway listening, and she tensed, waiting for him to tell them to stop, to shut up, to remember they were prisoners. But instead he smiled sadly and said, "My gran used to sing that. Different words but same tune. Funny that." And there was something in his voice that suggested he understood more than he was saying about the strangeness of war and shared humanity and the arbitrary nature of borders. Later that night, one of the women, a former teacher named Anna, who'd spent years teaching children about the greatness of the Reich, broke down completely. "How do we reconcile this?" she asked, her voice raw with confusion and pain. Everything we were told, everything we believed, how do we square it with this? And she gestured around the barracks at the warm stove glowing in the corner, the clean bunks with their blankets, the small comforts they'd been granted that shouldn't exist in an enemy prison camp. Maybe we don't, Lysel said quietly into the silence that followed. Maybe we just accept that we were lied to, and the words hung in the air like smoke. Because accepting that meant accepting everything else that came with it. That meant accepting that the war they'd supported might have been unjust, that the ideology they'd been raised in might have been poison, that the future they'd imagined, that 1,000-year Reich they'd been promised, with its prosperity and pride, had been nothing but a fairy tale told to children to make them complicit in atrocities. It was easier to believe the British were lying now, playing some kind of long game, softening them up for some future cruelty that would come when they least expected it. But weeks passed, and then months, and the cruelty never came, never materialized, and the cognitive dissonance only grew stronger. "I received a letter from home today," Lysel wrote in her diary one cold November evening, "or what used to be home. My mother is alive, living in the ruins of our apartment building in Hamburg. She has no heat, little food, and her words are desperate. She asked if the British are treating me well, and I didn't know how to answer her. How do I tell her that I eat 3 meals a day while she starves? That I have a warm bed while she sleeps under rubble? That the enemy has shown me more mercy than I ever expected, while Germany, our Germany, has become a graveyard? I feel guilty for every bite of bread, but I eat it anyway because what else can I do? Refuse to eat out of solidarity with suffering I cannot share." The winter brought its own revelations as the temperature dropped and the days grew short. And the British rationing system they learned was strict but fair in a way that surprised them, because everyone had a ration book from King George himself down to the lowest laborer, and everyone made do with the same allowances. No special privileges for rank or birth. The guards ate the same food they did, the same portions, the same monotonous rotation of meals. And Mrs. Davies, the cook, mentioned one day that she'd given up her sugar ration for the entire month to make that birthday cake for Greta. Just given it up without being asked, without expecting anything in return. "You didn't have to do that," Greta said, stricken by the sacrifice. "No," Mrs. Davies agreed. "But someone did it for my boys when they were stationed abroad. Someone was kind to them when they were far from home. Seemed right to pass it on." And she said it matter-of-factly, as though kindness were just something you paid forward in the world, an investment in human decency that would come back around somehow. In December, the camp administration organized a Christmas celebration. Nothing elaborate because Britain itself was still struggling, but some evergreen branches were brought in. A few handmade decorations appeared. Carols were sung in a mixture of German and English that created a strange hybrid harmony, and the guards brought extra coal for the stoves, so the barracks would be warm on Christmas Eve. Someone produced a handful of chocolate bars, American chocolate from a care package, and distributed them among the prisoners with careful fairness, one small piece for each woman, and Margaret held hers for a long time before unwrapping it, just feeling the weight of it in her palm, because she'd forgotten what chocolate tasted like, forgotten that such luxuries still existed somewhere in the world. When she finally bit into it, the sweetness was so overwhelming she had to sit down, had to close her eyes and just let the flavor fill her mouth while tears ran down her face. "We were supposed to hate them," Anna said that night, as they sat together in the warm barracks while snow began to fall outside. And Lysel finished the thought that they were all thinking, "They made it so easy to hate them with their propaganda and their promises, and now they make it impossible by just being decent human beings." The truth was settling in, heavy and undeniable like a weight in their chests. And they'd been wrong, not just about the British, but about everything. about the entire framework they'd used to understand the world. The ideology that had promised them greatness had delivered only ruin. The propaganda that had warned them about enemy savagery had been projection. A description of what Germany itself had done reflected back as accusation. And the men who'd told them these lies were either dead or in hiding, leaving them to pick through the rubble of their beliefs alone. Repatriation began in the early spring of 1946 as Europe slowly tried to put itself back together, and they were processed in groups, given documents and a small amount of money and transport arrangements back to Germany. And many of them didn't want to go, because Britain, even in its rationed austerity, was safer than Germany, where starvation and chaos still reigned and the future was terrifyingly uncertain. But they had no choice because they were German nationals, and they belonged in Germany whether they wanted to or not, because the war was over and it was time to go home even if home no longer existed in any recognizable form. Margaret returned to Hamburg to find her neighborhood unrecognizable. Streets she'd walked as a child now just paths through rubble, and the hospital where she'd trained was a crater. A hole in the ground filled with broken bricks and twisted metal, and her family's apartment building was half collapsed. The upper floors just gone. She moved in with her sister who'd survived by black market trading and didn't want to hear about Margaret's time in England, didn't want to know about the cozy imprisonment or the kindness or any of it, because she'd been here in the ruins, and that was real suffering, and Margaret's experience didn't fit the narrative. Liesl went back to Schleswig-Holstein to find her parents' house occupied by refugees from the east, families who'd been driven from their homes in the final convulsions of war, and she didn't argue with them, didn't try to reclaim what had been hers, because where else were they supposed to go? What else were they supposed to do? She found work as a translator for the British occupation authorities, the only job available to someone with her skills and her experience, and her former neighbors called her a collaborator, whispered about her when she walked past, but she ignored them because survival mattered more than their judgment. Greta, the youngest, struggled the most because she'd lost her entire family in the final days of the war. Everyone, parents and siblings and aunts and uncles all gone, and she had no home to return to. No one waiting for her with open arms. She drifted through the occupation zones taking odd jobs when she could find them, sleeping in refugee centers, carrying her few possessions in a battered suitcase. And for years she told no one about her time in Britain because it felt too strange, too at odds with the suffering around her, like a dream she'd had that didn't belong to the waking world. But they wrote letters, slowly and carefully, finding each other again through the chaos of post-war Europe, and a network formed, a network of women who'd shared the same transformative experience and couldn't quite explain it to anyone else, who understood each other in ways that outsiders never could. In 1953, Margaret organized the first reunion, sending letters to every address she could find, and 8 of them came, meeting in a cafe in Hanover on a bright spring morning, and they talked late into the night, comparing memories and filling in gaps and finding comfort in shared understanding. "Do you ever think about Mrs. Davies?" Greta asked as they sat around a table littered with coffee cups and cake crumbs, and Margaret admitted, "All the time. I wrote to her once, sent it to the camp hoping they'd forward it. Never heard back, but I still think about her." "I think about Thomas," Liesl said. "Wonder if he made it home to his farm. Wonder if he's happy." They'd all carried pieces of that winter with them, small kindnesses that had cracked their certainty open like eggs, moments of humanity that had forced them to rebuild their understanding of the world from the ground up. And some had embraced it, using their experience as a foundation for new beliefs and new ways of being, while others had buried it deep, finding it too painful to reconcile with their loyalty to Germany or their grief over what had been lost. But none of them had forgotten. Not a single moment, not a single gesture of kindness, and those memories shaped the women they became. In 1967, a British journalist researching prisoner of war camps stumbled across their story in some dusty archive, and he tracked down several of the women and interviewed them at length. And the article he published, titled "The Prisoners Who Came Home Changed," caused a minor scandal in Germany because critics accused the women of exaggerating British kindness to flatter their former captives, of creating a false narrative that absolved the Allies of their own crimes. Defenders argued that their testimony was valuable precisely because it was unexpected, because it challenged the simple narratives everyone wanted to believe about good and evil. Liesel, by then a grandmother living in Kiel with her family around her, wrote a letter to the editor that was published in full because her words carried weight. "I don't expect anyone to believe that our imprisonment was pleasant," she wrote. "It wasn't. We were frightened, displaced, uncertain of our futures, separated from everything we'd known. But the British did not abuse us. They did not torture us. They did not violate us. They treated us as human beings even though we were the enemy, even though we'd worked for a regime that had brought unspeakable horror to the world. This shocked us because we'd been taught they would do the opposite, taught that capture meant death or worse than death. And that shock, that moment when expectation collided with reality, changed us fundamentally. It forced us to question everything we'd been told, everything we'd believed, everything we'd built our identities around. And for some of us, that questioning led to new understanding and growth, while for others it led to despair and confusion. But I think it was necessary. I think Germany had to confront its lies, and we had to confront ours. The British didn't set out to teach us anything. They weren't trying to reform us or prove a point. They just behaved with basic decency, and that it seemed revolutionary to us tells you everything you need to know about what we'd become. The knock came at dawn, and they'd braced themselves for cruelty and received bread instead. And that single moment, that simple reversal of expectation, rippled outward through decades, shaping how 23 women understood the war and their country and themselves and their place in a broken world. This is one of thousands of untold stories from World War II, stories that challenge what we think we know about heroes and enemies, and the clear lines we like to draw between them. Stories about propaganda and truth and the complicated reality that exists between them. So subscribe now to make sure you never miss these hidden chapters of history that don't fit neatly into textbooks. Share this video with anyone who believes the past is simpler than it actually was. Anyone who thinks history is just dates and battles and famous speeches. Because history is made in smaller moments too. Moments that don't make it into the documentaries or the monuments. History remembers the big battles and the famous leaders and the turning points that shifted the course of nations. Everyone knows about D-Day and Stalingrad and Hiroshima. But history is also made in smaller moments that matter just as much in their own way. A guard who brings bread instead of violence to women who expected only cruelty. A cook who surrenders her sugar ration to make a birthday cake for an enemy prisoner who turned 20 in captivity. A young soldier who shares photographs of his dog with women who are supposed to be monsters but are just frightened and far from home. These moments don't win wars. They don't change military outcomes or diplomatic negotiations, but they win something else entirely, something harder to quantify but just as important. They win the slow, difficult work of rebuilding common humanity from the ruins of ideology, of finding connection across the chasms that war and propaganda create, of remembering that enemies are still human beings who feel fear and hunger and gratitude. The women who'd screamed at that knock in September 1945 spent the rest of their lives processing what came after, turning it over in their minds like a puzzle they could never quite solve. And some became advocates for reconciliation between nations, working to build bridges where there had been only bombs, while others retreated into silence. unable to speak about experiences that didn't match anyone's narrative of the war. A few never stopped grieving for the Germany they'd believed in, even as they acknowledged the Germany that had actually existed, caught forever between two versions of reality that couldn't both be true. But all of them carried the memory of that morning, carried it like a weight and a gift simultaneously. The moment when fear met kindness head-on, when expectation shattered against reality like glass, when the knock on the door brought not violation but breakfast, not cruelty but basic human decency. And in that moment, small and unremarkable and buried in the footnotes of history, everything changed for them, and nothing would ever be quite the same. What happened in that barracks near Nottingham wasn't unique, because similar scenes played out in prisoner-of-war camps across the Allied territories, wherever captured enemies were treated according to the Geneva Conventions rather than the thirst for vengeance, wherever the rule of law prevailed over the desire for revenge. But each instance mattered in its own way. Each reversal of expectation planted a seed in someone's consciousness, seeds that sometimes grew into broader understanding and sometimes withered from lack of nourishment, but they were planted nonetheless, and some of them took root in ways that would only become apparent years later. Germany spent decades after the war grappling with its past, confronting the lies it had told itself about superiority and destiny, excavating the truth from beneath layers and layers of propaganda that had seemed so convincing at the time. And that reckoning didn't start in courtrooms or parliaments or official commissions. It started in moments like these, in the cognitive dissonance of prisoners who'd expected brutality and received bread instead, in the slow collapse of certainty, in the painful reconstruction of morality from first principles, when all the old principles had been exposed as hollow. The British guards who knocked on that door probably never thought about it again, because for them it was routine, just another morning, just another group of prisoners, just another meal delivered as part of their duties. Nothing special or remarkable about basic human decency. But for the 23 women inside that barracks, it was the beginning of everything. The beginning of doubt that would grow into understanding. The beginning of questions that would reshape their entire worldview. The beginning of the long journey back to a humanity they'd been taught to abandon, in service of something they'd believed was greater. 79 years later, most of those women are gone now, returned to the earth they once fought over. And Margaret died in 1998, with her children and grandchildren around her. Liesl in 2003, in the same house in Kiel, where she'd written that letter to the editor. Greta in 2011 alone in a small apartment but at peace with her memories. Their children and grandchildren carry fragments of their stories like inherited jewelry, sometimes unsure what to do with them or how to wear them. Because how do you inherit the memory of a moment that undid everything your grandmother believed? How do you carry forward a story about the enemy showing unexpected kindness when the narratives we tell about war are supposed to be simple and clear? But the story persists because it has to persist, because it contains something essential about human nature that we need to remember. And the knock on the door keeps coming in different forms, in different conflicts, in different centuries. Wherever ideology tries to paint the enemy as inhuman, wherever propaganda insists that the other side is incapable of decency or mercy or basic humanity. And the answer to that knock, whether it brings violence or breakfast, vengeance or mercy, hatred or simple human kindness, still shapes the world we wake up to every single morning, still determines what kind of future we're building for the next generation. They'd shouted, "We won't take our clothes off into the darkness," braced for violation they were certain would come, certain of cruelty because that's what they'd been taught to expect, prepared to resist the only way they knew how with whatever dignity they could maintain. Instead they got bread, warm bread with a golden crust and margarine and marmalade, and impossibly a bottle of fresh milk. And that simple act of feeding prisoners before interrogating them changed everything, cracked open their certainty like an egg, let light in where there had been only darkness and fear. And 23 women began the long, slow process of understanding that everything they'd been told was a lie, that the enemy was just people too, that maybe, just maybe, the world was more complicated than the propaganda had allowed them to believe. And maybe that complexity, that messy, uncomfortable reality where enemies could be kind, and certainty could shatter, and breakfast could mean more than just food. Maybe that was the truth they'd been searching for all along without knowing it.